Hi, welcome to Queer Joe. Today I thought I'd go through a couple of my tips and techniques and hopefully helpful ideas and even philosophies about weaving in ends. I know a lot of people consider weaving in ends to be kind of the bane of their existence. And I've come to think of it as just another knitting technique, just another tool in my toolbox of knitting techniques, and one that I just consider a part of knitting. And so, from a philosophical perspective, I find it's a little bit easier to think of it just like casting on is different than knitting. It's just a different aspect of knitting. A couple of things I want to talk about though. There are multiple tools that you can use when it comes to weaving in ends. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about when's best to use some of them and when's not, and also some recommendations about tools. So your typical, most common tool for weaving in ends is what they call a blunt yarn needle or a darning needle, sometimes it's called. And it's basically used as it's got an eye that's big enough to put yarn through, and it usually has a blunt end so that it doesn't split your yarn. And that's typically what most people use to weave in their ends. Oftentimes you'll see chibis as the container for them. Now you can also see that there are plastic blunt end yarn needles and different shapes and types, and like most of my knitting tools, I've collected a number over the years. One thing I would caution against, a lot of the imports from China these days allow you to import large numbers of these quote-unquote darning needles or yarn needles. And I just want to caution you, and I'm not sure if I can show you this very clearly, but these are actually formed quite a bit differently than the cheap ones that you import from China are done slightly differently. You might notice that the eye of the needle itself looks like it has extra junk, extra pieces of metal in it. And that's because it's molded. And I also find that the tip of it is kind of a weird tip that doesn't work very well. So I don't recommend. This is one of the few times where I don't recommend you import something from China associated with some of your tools. One of the other tools that somebody turned me on to at the men's knitting retreats was these really long Susan Bates darning needles. They're extra long, so you can actually weave in your ends much more efficiently because you can weave in longer stretches of weaving in. It's particularly useful when you're doing things like crochet and weaving in the ends of your crochet. The thing that I like best is a sharper pointed needle. Now and I'll kind of do a slight comparison, most of the ends for the needles are blunt ends, and I prefer a sharper end, and I'll tell you why. Both the needles need to have a big enough eye so that you can actually insert the yarn. So a couple things. If I'm making a scarf or a sweater for myself, and I don't particularly care how the woven end looks, like it's going to be in the inside of a sweater that I'm going to be wearing, and I don't really care how it looks particularly, I will use the standard blunt end needle. Actually, I'll go with the longer blunt end needle, but either one would work the same. The yarn doesn't have to be hidden. It doesn't have to be overly secure. If it comes out, I can fix it. So I'm not too concerned about some of the times when I weave in ends. But oftentimes I'm knitting things for a baby or a gift for somebody else or to sell at my craft shows. And so I want to make sure that when I weave in those ends that they're both secure and they're hidden as much as possible. So one of the examples I'm going to go through is weaving in an end on this scarf that I'm currently working on. This is the yarn I'm using is a worsted weight. It's 4 ply, so it's actually 4 different plies of yarn into one. And one of the things I recommend is if you want to really hide it and also make sure it's really secure, which I do because this scarf is going to be given away as a gift, it's going to be donated. What I typically suggest is that you unply the yarn. And the way I do that is untwist the ply, insert my yarn. Now, you could actually unply it into all 4 separate plies. I don't recommend doing that because it's not necessary. I just usually try to do it in half or third of what the yarn is. So if it's a 6-ply yarn, I might do it in 3 plies of 2, or this is a 4-ply yarn, so I'm just going to do it in two sets of 2 plies. So here I separated the yarn into 2 plies of each. And I have to unwind this a bit. And I let it relax so that it unfurls a little bit. And then I also recommend, if you're going to hide it, that you actually split the yarn. And to do that, it's easiest to use a sharp pointed needle, not a blunt pointed needle. So I highly recommend the sharp pointed needle. So I thread my sharp pointed needle. I'll try to put this close up enough. Now, in order to be able to hide this, especially in garter stitch, it's a little bit easier. I want to make sure it's obviously in the same color, but I also want to make sure it goes into the ridge of the furrow kind of part of the garter stitch piece. And in order to do that, I actually want to split the yarn that I'm weaving it into. So I actually just kind of pick up the top of the yarn, and I do it as close to the furrow as I possibly can. And I pick up as many pieces of yarn as I can in the same colorway of the yarn that I'm weaving in. Typically, I like to weave in about 3 inches of yarn. That usually takes about 3 passes of the yarn, or 3 passes of the needle for me. So I do about 1 inch each time. A little bit more probably. And you can see that I'm actually going through and splitting that yarn. It actually makes it more secure, it hides it better. And the fact that I've split the yarn that I'm weaving into 2 plies, it means it's twice as hard for it to come out. And I'll do one more piece of that. One of the things I will do also is if I'm working in a particularly lacy fabric, I will actually go back through on a different piece. It will doubly secure it, and so that if the fabric stretches out, it will actually resist pulling out the main section of where I've woven the yarn in. And so basically I've woven it in by going down this way and then back a little bit this way. And I usually only go back one needle length to be able to do that. I also do that with baby garments where it's kind of critical that the yarn doesn't come unplied. One of the most difficult things I worry about these days when I'm weaving in ends is when I go to snip that yarn, that I only snip the woven in yarn and that I don't snip part of my actual knitting. So I don't know how many times I've actually snipped my knitting, but the times that I've done it, it's been kind of a nightmare to fix. So that's typically how I most securely and hiddenly weave in my yarn ends. I'd go back and I'd take the second of the 2 plies that I separated and weave in that end in a different row of yarn so that it's more hidden, and but also in the same colorway. Hopefully that's helpful, and hopefully if you have any questions, feel free to leave comments and or subscribe to the video. Thanks.